Welcome to part 4 of my reflections on the result of the EU referendum. My name is Nigel Marriott and I'm an independent political consultant based in Bath, United Kingdom. And in this presentation I'm going to explore what's going to be happening in the forthcoming by-election. I'm hoping you've seen the other 3 parts that I've already published on YouTube. So in part 1 I looked at where and how did Lib win. In part 2, I looked in more detail to why did Lib win, using data from Lord Ashcroft, who published an exit poll on the day after the referendum, and I'm going to be making use of that in this presentation. It also included a model to estimate the results at the seat level, basically working out which of the 650 constituencies had voted Remain and Leave. In part 3, I looked at the implications for the next general election using that seat model, and I recommend you have a look at that one because it's some really interesting insight. But what we're going to be looking at here are some forthcoming by-elections. There's already been one in Witney, there's one coming up in Richmond Park in London, which is the main subject of this presentation, but there's also going to be another one in Sleaford and North Hykeham, and I'll cover that one. Part 4 will be looking at personal reflection. So let's pick up from where we left off in part 3. In part 3, I had produced this map based on the assumption that the Liberal Democrats would be trying to revive their political fortune by becoming the anti-Brexit party. In other words, competing to try and keep Britain in the EU or mitigate any adverse effect from leaving the EU. What I used to produce this map is what I'm going to be describing in this presentation. But using that, I came up with 181 target seats for the Liberal Democrats to compete in. And the criteria behind it was that my anti-Brexit model had to give them either first or second place in a new election. And so those 100, plus also they needed to have kept their deposit in the 2015 election. Basically, they need to have a little bit of a base to begin with, and then have the potential to become first or second in the seats that are shown here. Notice I don't cover Scotland or Northern Ireland here in this presentation. That's because of the fact that the politics in those two countries are quite different, Brexit notwithstanding. One of the problems I highlighted before with the anti-Brexit approach to the Lib Dems is that while that gets about 181 first and second places, the majority of them are going to be in second place, that they're not actually going to win that many seats. They can, with this strategy, they can get their vote share back up from about 8% to about 20%. But the biggest problem is that most of these second places are going to be in safe Conservative seats. And the colours here indicate the parties that currently have the seat today. So light blue, the blues are the Conservatives, the red the Labour, and the orange golds are the Liberal Democrat seat. And you can see that where the Lib Dems will end up competing is essentially the South England, which is practically all Conservative seats in outside the cities. And in most cases, they're really projected to come second. The Labour seats, there's about 25 Labour seats that I recommend a Liberal Democrat target, but they're pretty much all in the cities. You can see a whole bunch here in central London, like Cambridge, Norwich, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, etc., York. It's the cities where there are some ability for the Lib Dem to compete. But they have a problem, the Lib Dems, when they go after Labour seats. I showed in the last presentation that these are also the seats where the Greens should be trying to target. So they're going to have competition in those seats if they go on an anti-Brexit route, especially if the Greens decide to follow the same strategy. Of these 181 seats, 43 of them, the Liberal Democrats had actually won back in 2010. So, there's some potential there. But I identified these 7 seats here, which are basically the 6 Conservative seats where they could win and 1 Labour seat where they could win. These are the 7 seats. And these, for me, are critical. For the Lib Dems to succeed with this strategy, they have to take these seats. There's no alternative. One is Bath, which is where I live, and the other one is Richmond Park, which is, of course, the by-election that's coming up. So that motivated this presentation to look at Richmond Park in more detail, because if Richmond Park is critical to the success of this strategy, then I decided to go into more detail to see what needs to happen in order for Richmond Park to be taken. Now, 2 others I've highlighted here, Twickenham and Kingston and Surbiton, and when you look at the map of London in more detail, you can actually see that those 3 constituencies are all neighbouring constituencies. So it's not just about winning Richmond Park, it's putting down the marker to win the neighbouring seats of Twickenham and Kingston and Surbiton, which were Lib Dem seats in 2010, but then they lost the seat to the Conservatives in 2015. Richmond Park was a Conservative seat in 2010, but I believe actually the Lib Dems had that seat in 2005. So there's history of the Lib Dems being successful in these areas. Now, obviously, the one reason why Richmond Park is attractive to the Lib Dems is the fact that the number of people voting Leave, or the number of people voting Remain, is high here. This was one of the seats that would heavily Remain, Richmond Park. But some people have been making the mistake of looking at the results here for Richmond upon Thames, where you can see only 31% of people voted Leave in the referendum, though 69% voted Remain. But Richmond upon Thames is not the same as the constituency Richmond Park. If you look at this map here, the black lines denote the constituencies, and the pink lines here denote the councils. The Richmond on Thames, if you follow that line, actually includes the whole of the Twickenham seat and most of Richmond Park. So that result here is Twickenham plus Richmond Park. It's misleading. To get the Richmond Park numbers, I've got to combine Richmond upon Thames and Kingston upon Thames to create a sort of giant counting area. So I get the combined result here. So the combined result for the 2 councils combined is 34% Leave. And then I've got to split that 34% Leave across the 3 constituencies. And this is where my seat model came into play. So I estimate that in Richmond Park, 28% voted Leave, 35% voted Leave in Twickenham, and 39% voted Leave in Kingston and Surbiton. Now, those who've seen part 2 and also part 3 will know that my model is based on something I call the Green Kipper Index. So the Green Kipper Index is simply the UKIP vote share minus the Green vote share. So in Richmond Park, it's minus 2%, whereas in Kingston and Surbiton it's plus 3%. And down here you can actually see what the election results were in 2015. So here we see that UKIP is at 4% in Richmond Park, Green are at 6%, so there you can see I get minus 2. We see a similar pattern when we look at the 2 local authorities. Down here we've got the 2014 EU election. And again, you can see the Green Kipper effect here. So it's about 9-10% in Kingston and about 5-4%, when you take into account rounding in Richmond upon Thames. So that's what I've used to extrapolate into the Leave vote here. And clearly, if in Richmond Park 72% of people have voted Remain, then obviously that's a good pool for an anti-Brexit party to try and, win the seat with. But one of the big mistakes that some people are making is to assume that everybody who voted Remain are committed Remainers. Now, this is what my anti-Brexit model or my by-election model is going to concentrate on, is that of the people that voted Remain or Leave, how many of those would actually appeal to an anti-Brexit party? And you notice this is quite interesting here. According to that model, it says only 42% of people in Richmond Park could be attractive to an anti-Brexit party, whereas Twickenham, 48% would be attracted, even though there are fewer Remainers. So how have I come up with that? Well, I based all this on the Lord Ashcroft exit poll, I mean in quotation marks here, on the 23rd of June. Lord Ashcroft actually carried out the survey of 12,000 people on the 23rd of June and then published his result the day after the referendum. So as much as possible, he was speaking to people that had already voted. And with 12,000 people, that allowed him to go into a fair degree of detail. I covered the analysis of the question, the chart here, in part 1 and 2. So I've already covered it, but I've basically pulled together the key chart that form the basis of my anti-Brexit model that I've been using. So let's start here. The first bit we have to decide is that, okay, in fact, I'll go back to that chart. We can see in Richmond Park in 2015, 58% of people voted Conservative. So of that 58%, how many of them voted Leave and how many voted Remain? Well, Lord Ashcroft asked this question and broke down the respondent to his exit poll by how they voted in 2015. And you can see overall, 58% of Conservative voters voted Leave, 42% voted Remain. Whereas for Labour and SNP, it was the other way round, effectively, 60-40 in favour of Remain, and the Lib Dems and Greens were even more strongly in favour of Remain. So the first way you could do it would be to take those percentages, split the numbers here, and then add those numbers up to see if you get 28% Leave and 72% Remain. Now, I'm hoping you can figure out straight away that you wouldn't, because the Conservative Party got 58% of the vote in Richmond Park. So I take these as guideline that what you have to do is, in effect, slide all the bars up or down, this dividing point, up or down in equal proportion across all the parties, until the Leave vote get to 28% and the Remain vote get to 72%. And if you do that, this is my estimate of how the voters for each party in 2015 would be split in terms of their referendum vote. So you can see the majority of Conservative voters probably voted Remain. Practically every Lib Dem voter voted Remain. Same goes for Labour. Practically every UKIP voter voted Leave, and conversely for Green. So the anti-Brexit party, clearly there's a lot of potential with the Lib Dems and also with the Greens and the Labour Party. But equally, there's a large chunk of Conservative voters who almost certainly voted Remain. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible to get 72% voting Remain. So that's the first step. But then, as I said, not every Remainer is a committed Remainer. Some could easily change their mind or be willing to accept the result and just move on. Equally, there could be some Leavers that regret their vote and would like the opportunity to vote again and this time vote Remain. So can we figure out what that breakdown might be between those that would not change their mind and those that would change their mind? Now, in this Lord Ashcroft poll, question 22, I believe, was this one. What Lord Ashcroft asked people to do was to consider about 15 topics, basically, such as cost of living, the NHS, border controls, etc. And then he asked everybody to choose would the UK be better off leaving the EU or remaining in the EU for those issues alone? So let's take, for example, job prospect. 49% of people said that in terms of, would the UK be better off leaving the EU? Only 49% of people said we're better off leaving the EU in terms of job prospect, which meant that 51% of people said that we would be better off leaving the EU, remaining in the EU. So that's overall. But the far more interesting split comes from when you split people down by whether or not they voted leave or remain. So let's look at the leavers first of all. There's a bunch of questions here which you can see are largely about the economy and Britain's influence in the world. And amongst leave voters, 75 to 90% said that we were better off leaving the EU, but it's still a significant proportion, 10 to 25%, that said we would be better off remaining in the EU for those issues, even though they voted leave. Let's just remind ourselves, these people voted leave, but when asked this question on the 23rd of June, so on the day they voted, on average, 1 in 6 of leave voters said when it came to these issues around the economy and influence, we'd be better off staying in the EU. Now that, to my mind, is a potential regret group. Because these are people that, they think, we should leave the EU, probably on the ground of immigration and sovereignty, which were the two key issues for leave voters. But, they were willing to concede that there could be a cost to that in terms of, the economy and the cost of living. So that is this group here, the regret group. Now, potential regret, but it's basically 1 in 6 leavers potentially, if everything all went to hell in terms of the economy and Britain's influence and foreign policy, might be prepared to say, well, actually, maybe we got it wrong. Conversely, on the remaining side, pretty much every Remainer believed, well, Britain was better off in the EU. Now, as you go down here, we move from questions where, leavers are prepared to concede that the Remain side has a point, down to questions where the leavers are pretty certain that they are right. So you get down finally to this group of the sovereignty immigration group, which was by far and away the number one issue for leave voters. And here, this time we need to look at the Remain voters. On Remainers here, Remainers are pretty certain of their argument, but until we start getting down to these questions around what I broadly call fairness and quality issues, where this time the Remainers start to concede that the leavers might have a point that we would be better off outside the EU. But when we get to the sovereignty immigration issues, we get quite a striking result here. Between 40 and 50% of Remain voters concede the argument on sovereignty and immigration, that if they're looking at sovereignty and immigration alone, we are better off outside the EU. But they still voted Remain. So that tells me that this group here, these two groups, now overall it averaged about 44% of people answered that we'd be better off leaving on the question, even though they voted Remain. But it's different between the political parties. On the other questions here, there's no difference between the political parties. But here, on those questions, sovereignty immigration, there was a clear difference. For Conservative and UKIP voters, about 54% of Remainers fall into that camp. The half of UKIP and Conservative Remain voters, UKIP Remain voters are practically non-existent, but certainly amongst the Conservative Remain voters, half of them can concede the argument on sovereignty and immigration to the Leave side, whereas amongst Labour, Lib Dems and the Greens, only about a third would concede that argument. So that then leaves, if it's 44% overall that, are willing to concede the argument on these, that leaves about 50-odd% who would appear to be much more pro-EU. They're not bothered about these issues, or at least they don't think we're better off outside the EU. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're still fanatically pro-EU. There was another question asked, I think it was question 26, where Lord Ashcroft asked the Remain voters, what were your reasons for voting voting Remain? 43% said it was because of economic risks, which pretty much backs up what I said about my analysis of these questions here. So around 44%, differing between the political parties, basically said they voted Remain, but not out of love for the EU, but because they were concerned about taking risks with the economy. The second most common reason for voting Remain was a group of people, 31% of Remainers, who said, well, at the moment, we're getting the best of both worlds. We're in the EU, but we're not in the Euro. We're not in the Schengen zone. We're not going to be integrated otherwise. So in other words, they were effectively saying we've got the best of both worlds. We've got 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and that's a good place to be. And I want to keep that. And that's why they voted. Really, that then leaves, among Conservative voters, only about 15% of Conservative voters and about 30%, or about a third of Labour and Lib Dem voters, who I would then classify as pro-EU. And then, of course, the final category here is what I call the Brexiteers. These are the people that aren't potential Brexit. And I really couldn't find any further distinction amongst those Brexiteers. I could probably make a split there between the left behind, which I talked about in part 2, and those that are not left behind, but I didn't think that was worthwhile doing for this model. So I can now take these figures, so I can now take, I've already split the parties into Remainers and Leavers, and then of the 20% that voted Conservative and Leave, as shown by this bar, I can now say, well, 1 in 6 of those are potential Brexiteers. Of the 38% or so that's left over of Conservative voters that voted Remain, I can now say, well, 54% of those are people that the only reason they didn't vote Leave was because of the economic risks. And conversely, I can do the same for the other parties. So when I do all that, I will be splitting the voters into a variety of segments broken down by party and by the EU voter segment. Now, that might sound quite complicated, is that, can I really go that far in drawing conclusion? So before I did that for Richmond Park, I decided to have a go for this for Witney. Now, this analysis was done after the Witney by-election. This, of course, was David Cameron's seat. He stepped down from this, and in the by-election, the Conservatives kept the seat. But you can see their vote was down. Here's the actual result in the by-election: 45% Conservative, 30% for the Lib Dems, which was a considerable change from the 2015 general election when the Conservatives got 60% and Lib Dems got 7%. So, Tim Farron is on record saying that the Lib Dems threw the kitchen sink at Witney to get across their anti-Brexit message. And they're being rewarded with second place and 30% of the vote. And the Conservative vote looked like it's been squeezed. So, does this mean that the anti-Brexit appeal is there? Well, what I did was to do exactly as I've described here for Richmond Park, except, of course, that the Remain vote in Witney was different. We can see that the Leave vote was 46%, the Remain vote was 54%. So a majority voted Remain, but not as high as Richmond Park. So here is the split of the 2015 voters by party into their Leave and Remain camp. And then of the 31% that I said voted Conservative and Remain, I think that then splits into these groups here. So 17% of people were voted Conservative, voted Remain, and they voted Remain on the ground that they don't love the EU, but they didn't want to take the risk with the economy. Conversely, on the Brexit side, you can see 29% of Conservative voters, I estimated, 29% of voters voted Conservative in 2015 and Leave in 2016, the bulk of which are Brexiteers, so 25%, and then 5% are potential Brexiteers. And I've done this for every party here. And then when you add up here, across all the parties, you see 12% of people in Witney would fall into the pro-EU camp, 70% in the best of both, etc., etc. So then I've got my split of the constituency. But I've now got to identify the people who would be most likely to vote for an anti-Brexit party. So who would they be? Well, I think we can say pretty easy to say that the Brexiteers almost certainly will not be voting for an anti-Brexit party. They're pretty solid about their vote, so we can write them off. They're definitely not going to vote for the anti-Brexit party. Which party will they vote for? Now, what I've assumed so far is to say, well, the Conservative Brexiteers will stay with the Conservative. The Lib Dem Brexiteers will switch to the Conservative. And the other parties will stay where they are. Now, the reason why I say the Lib Dems will switch is because of their explicit anti-Brexit strategy. So I've assumed that if you're a Brexiteer and voted Lib Dem, you're not going to be happy about that. And you'll switch to the Conservative to being the most plausible alternative. So that's the first assumption here. Among the Brexiteers, I've assumed that I've made the following assumption, that the UKIP Brexiteers will switch to the Lib Dems, Labour and Greens and others will remain unchanged, and half of the Conservative Brexiteers will switch to the Lib Dems, hence the shaded colours here, blue and gold. Then we move to the Remain side. I basically said that all pro-EU voters will switch to the Lib Dems, with the exception of Labour. I've said that half of them will switch to the Lib Dems, the other half will stay with Labour. Now, obviously, UKIP, there's practically no Remain voters on UKIP, so, but for the sake of completeness, I put them saying that they're going to vote Lib Dem. Then we've got the best of both camps here. And I've followed a similar principle, except that this time I'm saying actually Labour and Green voters stay where they are, but the Conservative best of both will switch to the Lib Dem. Then we come to this group, the largest group of Remainers, who don't love the EU but didn't want to take the risk. Now, this is when we get into a bit of psychology. I'm saying that Conservative group will stay with the Conservatives. In other words, all Remainers in this group won't change their vote. I mean, why would that be the case? Well, I think there's two reasons. First of all, you've got to look at the economic news at the moment, and I think at best for the Lib Dems, you can argue it's a mixed package. There's lots of, good news, and there's lots of, such as the GDP figures. Conversely, there's the stuff you can point to as being bad, to say the exchange rate, if you're an importer, and plus a whole bunch of other statistics. You can play the stats game and pick out what suits your view. But I think you need to look at it from an emotional point of view. To me, leaving the EU is like asking for a divorce. In other words, Britain and the EU has had a rocky relationship, and basically they've had fundamentally irreconcilable differences. It's been a difficult marriage where Britain's view of how Europe should be run is fundamentally different from the rest of Europe. And it reached the point where, the argument's gone on for the years, and in the end, Britain said, look, we're leaving. Now, divorce hasn't happened. At the moment, all that's happened is the period where somebody has said, right, I'm leaving, I want a divorce. And when somebody says, I want a divorce, the other person will then react. They might react and say, well, okay, fair enough, I'm sorry about that we've reached this point, but let's, be amicable about it and, try and remain friends. Or they'll react emotionally and say, how dare you, you've got no right to do that, or, I still love you, I want you to stay. Which, if I'm honest, that's the way I feel Europe is reacting at the moment. It's reacting in a very angry, emotional fashion. And I'm not convinced that's actually helpful, but that's by the by, really. But when somebody said they want a divorce, some people actually do change their mind. So, and conversely, so the regretters here are the people who said, I want a divorce, and then said, oh, no, I don't want a divorce. They're changing their mind. The remainers are the other side. These people don't want the divorce. Now, if your partner just said, I want a divorce, how do you feel when they change their mind? And sometimes people will take the view of saying, you've made your decision. I'm sorry, it's gone. It's over. We're going to proceed with the divorce. This happened. And in effect, that is the attitude I've ascribed to the economic risk group. These are people that, made a decision, no, I don't want a divorce. But when the other side said, no, they do want a divorce, they said, okay, we've reached that point. Let's get on with it. And they're not going to be impressed by appeal to change your mind. So that's what the emotional outlook I've ascribed to that group. And that's why I basically said people will stay with their original party. Now, when I put all that logic together and then add up the figures, so add up all the blue cells, you get 45%, add up all the gold cells, you get 28%, etc., etc. You can see it actually predicts the by-election result pretty well. Not a bad attempt, actually. And if you add up the categories here that I feel are potentially would be listening to an anti-Brexit party, I come up with a figure of 36%. So if you add up the pro-EU, the best of both, and the regretters, you end up with a figure of 36% that potentially an anti-Brexit party could reach. And the Lib Dems got 30%. Now, bear in mind, of course, the Green Party. The Green Party is pro-EU, it's pro-Remain, and yet there were 4% of people voted for the Greens. So there's a question here as to whether the Lib Dems could have done better had they come to an agreement with the Green Party. We don't know. But I thought, following through that logic and following through the Lord Ashcroft poll here, I've arrived at some estimated figures for the Witney by-election that look, fairly consistent with the actual result. So I then went on to Richmond Park and I did exactly the same thing following through the figures, but this time came up with two forecasts. Now, the first forecast here is this line here, and that is if we follow the same thought process as Witney. We would basically add together all the categories that have been flagged as potential Lib Dem categories here, and add those up, and you get 42% for the Lib Dem vote. In that scenario, the Conservatives would have 40%, so the Lib Dems would squeak the seat. However, UKIP are not going to stand in this election. So, if that is the case, we probably should assume that the UKIP voters will go to the Conservatives. In that case, the Conservatives, who actually, it's Zach Goldsmith standing as an independent, rather than a Conservative, but still, he did vote Leave. He might just hold on. But whatever, this model is saying that the potential anti-Brexit party could get as much as 44% of the vote. Under the model, the Witney model, if I apply that, Lib Dems would get 42%. And let's not forget that in 2010, the Lib Dems got 43%. So it is possible for Lib Dems to win this seat. And remember, I said this is one of the 7 seats that the Lib Dems must win if their anti-Brexit strategy is to be successful. Now, that would have been my forecast. But there's already been an opinion poll here. This line here, it says actual, so that's not correct. That's an opinion poll that's been carried out by a company called BMG. They carry out polls now and again. And this is the figure that they've come up with here. So for Labour and the Green Party, it's pretty close. But you can see there's a big difference between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives here. And if I make a change to the Witney model, and this time, this segment here, the best of both, which in Witney I said switched to the Lib Dems. If I now say that that best of both category stayed with Zach Goldsmith as the Conservative or Independent Conservative candidate, then the vote switches around. The Lib Dems would go from 42 to 30%, and the Conservative go from 40 to 52%. And if we add in the UKIP voters, we're pretty much in line with that opinion poll. So I find that quite fascinating that I've taken two approaches here. I've taken the Witney approach, and I can come up with a plausible result for Witney, the explanation of the Witney result. I can use the Witney approach and come up with a plausible argument to say the Lib Dems can win this, and they have reached that level of votes in the past. But the opinion polls suggest that it's not succeeding so far for the Lib Dems. And I would suggest that this is the key category that the Lib Dems are not yet reaching in Richmond Park. Conservative voters, Remain voters, who have an attitude that, they would like to get the best of both worlds. But it suggests at the moment they're not really convinced by the Lib Dems. In Witney, it looked like they could have been convinced. This one here, it looked like they're not that convinced. In some respects, using my marriage analogy, again, these are people, their partner told them they want a divorce. And in Witney, they're basically saying, no, we want you back. Here, it looked like they're saying, okay, fair enough, I'm not happy about it, but let's get on with it. So now that's just one opinion poll. We've still got 3 weeks to go. It's on the 1st of December. The thing could change. But if I were the Lib Dems in Richmond Park, it's more than the kitchen sink. It's the whole house, bank, absolutely everything has got to be thrown at it. And the target here is twofold. Either the Conservative voters, this group here is the one to target, or the Green Party and the Lib Dems. Now, the problem is at the moment, I'm estimating that really only about 15% of voters fall into Labour Green. And, we need a 12% change in the poll. So, you're only going to get some of these. And this brings me back to this point. I really do think the Lib Dems have got to be talking with the Green Party over some alliance. Here, I think it's hurting them. I've already pointed out that UKIP standing down is probably helping Zach Goldsmith a bit. And I think the Lib Dems have got to seriously look at doing the same thing with the Green Party. The Labour Party is more problematic here. I find it a bit hard to read the Labour Party. I've pointed out in part 3 that the Labour Party demographics basically are split into two camps. They've got the most extreme Remainers and they've got the most extreme Leavers. And how they resolve that schizophrenia within their party, I don't know. For the moment, I'm saying that Labour voters will mostly stay with the Labour Party. There'll be a few here that will switch to the Lib Dems, but for the most part, I'm saying that Labour voters stay where they are. So that's Richmond Park here. And now the other by-election that come up is the MP for Sleaford and North Hykeham had decided to resign in protest at the government policies and fought the by-election here. Now this one here is a solid Conservative seat. You can see that it's in the Fenland area, just south of Lincoln. To the east here is the Boston and Skegness constituency, which actually was the biggest Leave seat in the whole country. And this is a strong Leave seat, 63%. So following the same logic that I've used in Witney and Richmond Park, I arrive at figures of 30% as being the maximum that an anti-Brexit party could take. Now, if it followed the Witney pattern, then these are the results. Going to be a comfortable win for the Conservatives, but the Lib Dems could take second place. And I think that's the target for the Lib Dems here in Sleaford and North Hykeham. Get second place. But you know what? This is what confirmed what I said right at the beginning. Well, let's get right back to the chart at the beginning. This chart here. This is the issue the Lib Dems have with this anti-Brexit strategy. If they target the Conservatives, they're going to end up with lots and lots and lots of second places, but very few wins. And it's because they are fighting in seats like Sleaford and North Hykeham, where the Conservatives are very well set. And there will be quite a lot of Leave voters, and they're not really, in my opinion, going to be receptive to an anti-Brexit party. But the Lib Dems can take second place. If, on the other hand, it followed the same pattern at Richmond Park, so this group here, this 6% of the best of both Conservative voters, don't bother to switch to the Lib Dems, then I'm looking at a lower figure here, and in fact this basically said that Labour would actually take second place. In fact, Lib Dem would actually lose them, Labour would keep their second place, basically. So my read here that this is the target for the Lib Dem. So I'm hoping from that, having looked at that, let me go back to one slide here, which is this one. So you can see I put up here on these 3 seats. Remember, these 3 seats have been flagged by me amongst the 7 key seats that the Lib Dems absolutely have to take. In Twickenham, Kingston and Surbiton, I put down the anti-Brexit vote. And in Twickenham, it's higher, the anti-Brexit vote, even though the Leave vote is higher. Now, the reason for that is that when you look at Twickenham, there are fewer Conservative voters. There are more Lib Dem voters in the first place. So with fewer Conservative voters, there are fewer in this category of economic risk. You'll find more pro-EU voters, and that combination creates a higher potential for an anti-Brexit vote. So it's not a straight function of the Leave vote. It's a function of the Leave vote and what the split was across the political parties that generate that anti-Brexit figure. And then from that allowed me to generate this map. As to where the potentials are for the Liberal Democrats as an anti-Brexit party. So I hope you found that informative. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you join me for my last part, where I look at my personal reflection of the referendum. Thank you.